Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Public Service Leadership Lab, in which we feature mentorship conversations between a leadership luminary and a current federal leader so they can work through real-life leadership issues and you can benefit from the lessons and insights shared. These conversations are part of Public Service Leadership Week, hosted by the Public Service Leadership Institute, during which we highlight the importance of developing effective government leadership and feature real leaders who are making an impact. My name is Kelly Shee, and I will serve as your moderator today. I lead strategy for the Public Service Leadership Institute at the Partnership for Public Service, a nonpartisan nonprofit working to build a better government and a stronger democracy. Our institute is the premier source for public service leadership programs, policies, and perspectives, bringing nearly 2 decades of experience in federal leadership development to training nearly 10,000 leaders each year. We use the framework of our public service leadership model, the standard for effective government leadership. And each of our mentorship conversations will focus on different values and competencies from the model. Today, we are focusing on the leading change and achieving results competencies. Leading change includes setting vision for change, embracing innovation, risk, and uncertainty, and exercising the influence and adaptability needed to lead and navigate change. Achieving results means managing skillfully, thinking strategically, and making good decisions that deliver measurable outcomes for the public. So I'm excited to dig into these two topics with two amazing leaders. First, I would like to welcome today's leadership luminary, Bernie Banks, the director of Rice University's Doerr Institute for New Leaders. Bernie is a retired U.S. Army brigadier general. He led leadership development at West Point, and he serves on the partnership's Government Leadership Advisory Council, bringing his decades of public service leadership experience to support our work as a coach and advisor. Hi, Bernie, and thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you very much, Kelly. It's wonderful to be here.
Amazing. And next, I'd like to welcome our current federal leader, April Smith-Hirak. She currently serves as the Regional Health Administrator at the Department of Health and Human Services and is also an alumna of the Institute's AI Federal Leadership Program. She also just celebrated 20 years in public service, so big congratulations, April, and thank you for your many years of service.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm very excited to speak with Bernie today.
Thank you both. All right. So let's get into it, and I'll start with you, April. We know that we are leading through some fraught times, and it's integral for all leaders, especially those in public service, to be able to navigate themselves and lead their people through change. So what aspects of leading change do you find most challenging?
You know, I think some of the aspects of leading change that I find really challenging are just the being thrust into change itself, that initial adjustment period, and being able to kind of regulate your reactions to new reality while leading others through their reactions. I think sometimes it's very easy to become overwhelmed by that. And so in my experience, when we've had huge organizational shifts or changes, there's a lot of emotion that comes up with my team and also with myself because we invest really heavily in our work. And when things shift and change, sometimes that can be a little bit hard to manage through. So to be able to regulate that for yourself while supporting your team through that is something that I find a little challenging and also really rewarding when you do get to do it finally.
Bernie, any reactions to that? Is that your experience around leading change, or do you have any sort of formative experiences you would want to share?
No, I most certainly resonate with what April just shared. The reality is that while we're leading change, we're also executing daily activities. And there's this tension between what the future requires and what the present demands. And as you're navigating that tension, I've got these short-term objectives I have to accomplish, but at the same time, I'm supposed to be investing in doing things a different way in order to meet a future need. Well, it can be tough to navigate that at times if you're being told, don't drop any balls. Both are important. Just figure it out. And so leaders have to be able to hold that tension. They have to be able to help people to recognize that, yes, there are things that we must do today, but yes, there are also things we must be preparing to do so that we ensure that we have a bright tomorrow. And I think that for most folks, that's probably the most difficult thing, because they frequently are told nothing can be sacrificed. But in the best change efforts, you do sacrifice some things in order to ensure you have clear prioritization of effort.
I think that really resonates with me, Bernie. I think, especially working in public health, there are a lot of things that we like to think of as evergreen. Like, they're evergreen issues. No matter what happens, they're our bread and butter. They're the things that we always have to do. And it's important to be able to keep that perspective as a leader for my team, to say these are evergreen, but we may be approaching them differently now. And how do we, maintain fidelity to those core issues that we work on every day while we accept and anticipate that change.
Absolutely. I can think of all the agencies that right now are trying to think about how do we leverage the emerging developments in artificial intelligence to enhance our organization's activities, right? And so you've got systems in place that you're currently utilizing. You've learned how to be very efficient with the use of those systems. But at the same time, you have the disruption of saying, if we were to integrate this, what would it take? How would we use it? What are the potential downsides? What are we going to have to learn along the way? And sometimes when taking a look at all that, you start saying, oh, this isn't a great investment of energy. This is the distraction of focus. There will be a time when we're forced to do that. Do we really need to be working on that right now? Is that taking away valuable bandwidth that we need to be expending on doing what we do every single day? So there's always going to be that tension we have to reconcile.
Bernie, that brings up something for me, which is a great point that you're making about that tension between it being something that we need to eventually address versus addressing it now and early. And as a leader, how have you experienced your leading change through some things that maybe it might be better to get in ahead of the game versus waiting until you have to respond? And how do you know which ones to take ahead of time strategically and which ones do you wait on? And how do you manage an organization through that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reality is there is no one right answer to this. So when thinking about my own experience, I think about doing a risk benefit analysis. How much risk would be involved in trying to go about something, and how much benefit would we derive if we got it right? At the same time, if we screw it up, what's the cost going to be, and can we absorb that cost? And so you're constantly doing that kind of framing and math, if you would, to figure out what risk are smart risk. I was a pilot in the military, and we had a saying, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there aren't too many old, bold pilots, because they took dumb risk and they didn't get to come back from the flight. Smart risk is there's a gap between the capabilities you possess and the knowledge you have and the thing you're going to have to navigate. But given those capabilities and your experience, you're like, it's highly likely I can successfully negotiate that gap. And in the event that I attempt it and I can't, I can still recover from it and live to fly another day. Dumb risk is that gap is such that it's probably not likely I can navigate it. And if I fail to, there's no coming back from it. Organizations must routinely underwrite smart risk and never underwrite dumb risk, just like you should never underwrite dumb risk when going out on a flight. And I've seen young pilots that tried to bite off more than they were ready for, and it had very, very severe consequences for them and others. They underwrote dumb risk born out of hubris. And I think the same thing's true for organizations. As a leader, you can't let your ego start determining what you're going to dictate your agency do without really understanding the risk involved and what the cost would be if you don't get it right, and what the benefits will be if you do get it right. And so trying to ensure that you are doing smart risk taking, that it was on something that would pay significant dividends going forward was always the thing I was focused on. Because you can always chase shiny objects. It doesn't mean that shiny object, once you chase it and you get to it, is something that's actually going to illuminate the way going forward. It was just a distraction.
I think that's really interesting. And it presents a conflict in my mind because, as a leader, part of your job is to cultivate the next generation of leaders. And I never want to limit that next generation of leaders. I want them to be creative. I want them to come up with solutions and think of new ways to do things. How do we balance when we're leading government that fine line between encouraging visionary leadership and maybe taking not smart risks? How do you incorporate that into your leadership style?
Well, when you think about creativity and some of the research on that, creativity has two components, novel and useful. And someone has to be able to demonstrate both. Because it's very easy to come up with something novel, but if I tie it back to the mission, I tie it back to how is this going to improve us, they can't show me in very definitive ways. And so I'm always quick to say, that's novel, that's interesting, but you haven't made a good use case for why it's useful. And so for the young folks, I think many times they can be prone to say, this is antiquated, this is this, and there's all these things coming out, but they haven't necessarily worked through. And it's not to say the case for all young people, because you have a number of them that come up with brilliant solutions that are both novel and useful. But in order to be able to go through the full spectrum of analysis, you have to think about both things. And that's how you work with the young folks. You don't shut them down. You have to help guide them along the way. You're not trying to take away their ability to be creative, but you are highlighting we're not going to pursue change just for change's sake. We pursue change in service of creating something that's better than what we currently have, not simply different.
That is great advice. And I remember starting in the government and having all of those ideas and being in meetings and saying, why don't we do X, Y, or Z? And hearing from the people who had been around longer, we tried that 10 years ago, it didn't work, right? So, I think there is this element also of like having had the experience and perspective of the long game versus a fresh set of eyes. It's really interesting to hear how to balance that. And I like that utility versus creativity analysis. It's really great.
So both of you have been involved in the partnership's AI Federal Leadership Program, April as a participant, Bernie as a coach. So I wanted to go down that road a little bit more and see if, I know you both brought it up earlier, if there's anything around that and what your agency is dealing with, April, or what you've been hearing in the leadership space, Bernie, around the many change efforts that are happening and will be happening in light of AI.
Well, I think at HHS, and it's hard to be one person speaking for an entire department, we have such a massive amount of programs and regulations and requirements all across all of our operating divisions. But I think as a department, what we've been trying to figure out is really where is that sweet spot and that balance between knowing what to regulate when it comes to AI and its application in our programming and our grants and our responsibilities, and also understanding its utility. Where might it help us? Where might it hurt us? And being really responsible and thoughtful about that. I think one of the things that HHS has done really well is that they have assembled a group of interested leaders who provide input, and sometimes without expertise or experience with AI. So you get a breadth of people who are, maybe executing use cases and really applying AI in their area versus people who might be a little bit more AI naive and are trying to understand its implementation. And when you get very skilled leaders together at that level to have those kinds of conversations, I think you come back with some better solutions. But, Bernie, being a coach and seeing probably all of the different use cases and interest levels that were in the program, I wonder what general advice you have for government and government leaders. And in that balance of, creativity and utility. Where do we find that leadership moment where we strike the right balance versus maybe going too far in the direction of risk or too far in the direction of safety?
So I'm the first to say I am not an expert on AI. However, I have seen a lot of use cases, not only in government, but also in the private sector and in higher education. And what I personally have observed as the most challenging and most important aspect of utilizing AI is coming up with the right governance structure, because that governance structure informs so many things. What kind of data are you going to collect? What the means for analysis? How will you utilize this? Are you aware of the biases associated with whatever framework you're employing? And so that governance mechanism is absolutely critical. And many times it takes a while to figure out what the right form of governance consists of. But that governance is going to allow you to make those decisions regarding how much risk. What are we willing to put into this? What are we going to do with it? All of that. All of that gets filtered through the prism of that or not the risk apparatus, but the governance apparatus. And so you can't really start to think about where are we going to go until we know who's going to help us to figure out what right looks like. And I don't know at HHS what the governance apparatus is for those sort of endeavors, but it's something that most certainly can not only involve people in the technical functions. It requires leaders throughout the organization who really understand process, procedure, desirable outcomes, what are the externalities we have to take into account, you name it.
That sounds great, and I think that's sound advice. It's tricky waters to navigate, especially to want to be able to adopt new technologies and utilize them to really save taxpayer dollars and improve efficiency. And then at the same time, really need to balance that with that governance and the safety protocols that need to be in place.
April, you brought up tricky waters. And one aspect of change, and one change that I think everyone is paying attention to and definitely aware of, is no matter what happens in the election later this year, there will be a transition in administration, which is something that in our government structure we work through as soon as every 4 years. And so, Bernie, you've been in public service for a long time, worked with a lot of different leaders. Any advice you have, regardless of what happens, we know there will be changes coming down the line for the many career civil servants that we work with and others working in government. Any advice you have for folks working through these kinds of transitions?
I go back to my experience as a pilot, and what we're taught in flight schools, the most difficult part of any flight are transitions. Takeoffs, landings, changing to different modes of operation. And so whenever you're entering into a transition state, that's where you should be on high alert. That's where you always refer to the checklist. You always reinforce the basics. You always come back to what is required for us to be successful in this current endeavor. And I think as we head into, a change of administration, you always have to think about what are those basics we must account for. How do we quickly ascertain the new set of priorities? How do we then develop a strategy related to those priorities? And then how do we start fostering accountability towards the achievement of those? And to not tie it simply to, I agree with this ideology or I don't agree with this ideology, but always coming back to the primacy of the mission and to doing our basics well as an organization. I've flown thousands of hours in an aircraft, but no matter how many times I prepare to land, I always refer to the checklist, because when people start to believe they no longer have to do that, that's when mistakes happen. And the same thing's true in these sort of organizational transitions. That instead of saying, okay, what do we know about what it takes to do that transition well, we start to, we got this, whatever it is, kind of move through it quickly, or we downplay the significance of it, name your thing. Transitions are always the most difficult things to navigate. So slow it down, be precise, focus on the mission and your basics. That would be my advice.
Brittany, can I ask you, fortunately we're not flying planes because that makes me so nervous, the idea that you do something wrong and you crash and possibly into civilians. That's just terrifying. We're a little safer in HHS, at least in my area. We're really very much a policy-oriented shop. But the transition process that happens, and this is, it's not my first rodeo. I've been through it many times before. We sort of know at a certain point, it doesn't matter what the administration change is, but you sort of know what to expect from that transition process. And in that transition process, what we do see is a lot of the political transition results in civilian employees stepping up and then, being civil servants as a temporary gap stop fill into those positions. And we do have a lot of leaders who will serve in acting roles that are traditionally political roles for a number of months in order to fill that gap in government and provide the continuity until we do have new political appointees. I frankly am unlikely to be one of those people who needs to step into a political position, but I know that there are many leaders who might be listening to this who will need to step into a political position while they are in a civil service kind of position. So do you have advice for them in that? I feel like as I watch it, that must be something incredibly difficult to step into, the life and thought process and role of a political leader when your actual role has been civil service.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And initially, my thoughts go to clearly defining the success criteria. What will you be held accountable for? When you think about accountability, there's a great article that says 5 things are necessary. But the number one thing is to start with clear expectations. You can't go in with the expectations of a career civil servant when operating in that role, because the success criteria is different for those who occupy the role. So do you educate yourself on the expectations and what will constitute success, and then gauge your actions to achieve those things, as opposed to overlaying the mindset you have coming from a career service and ignoring the realities of what that role entails? So clear expectations, understanding success criteria, adjusting accordingly. That's the best recipe, I believe, for being successful when operating in one of those temporary roles.
So as that next level of leadership that will be working with the civil servants who are going to have to step into those political roles, what can we do to support them and support the organization through that transition, and then support them on the other end being able to step back into their civil service role?
I believe it's incumbent upon those who occupy those roles to ask really good questions. Many times people will say, I don't know X, I don't know Y. And when you ask them, have you actually inquired about it? The answer is no, because they're just waiting for something to come from on high. And they keep waiting, and don't get what they actually need. The way we learn more effectively is by asking really good questions and then exploring the answers to those questions. And so the best thing you can do to help that leader and to help those you lead is to think very intently about, what questions do you need to pose in order to learn the expectations you must execute on?
Thank you for that.
Bernie, I love that you've brought up accountability in talking about achieving results, which is one of the sub-competencies under our achieving results competency. So, April, I wanted to turn it over to you. We've had a chance to hear kind of bits and pieces of the work that you do. I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about your role as a senior executive at HHS and what are some of those results that you all are trying to achieve and any challenges or lessons or questions that you might have around that for Bernie.
So, my office over the last several years has experienced its own major transition, and we have gone from administering a lot of programs to really being a very policy focused office. What that has meant for us is that the achieving results portion of those ECQs is always a little bit harder to define because our role is really as a liaison and to inform both policy formulation and implementation in our jurisdictions. So what we want to do is implement the policies that will help our jurisdictions have healthier populations ultimately. And then also to be aware of what is happening in those jurisdictions, what is the climate, what are the barriers to that implementation, or what is accelerating that implementation, to be able to carry that back and forth to Washington, to headquarters. So for us, this achieving results, we never really, or very rarely, have the ability to point to something and say, this was our win alone, right? This is the direct impact of our work, because our impact is in the incremental change. And so it's always very difficult. We don't want to focus our offices and our teams on what we like to call widget counting. So, I met with 3 partners today. I talked to 18 organizations. I had 37 people on a webinar or something. We try not to count those because those don't really talk about impact. They really talk about process. But to measure that impact, to measure that actual achieving results is very, very difficult. So Bernie, I would love to get your take on how do we make it so that we can communicate both to ourselves, to our leadership, to our stakeholders, what we're actually achieving, what are our results, when it's so hard for us to define that ourselves?
No, I think it's a wonderful question. And so it comes back to this notion that you highlighted on. Are we measuring process, or are we measuring commitments that we've secured? I think measuring those commitments you've secured is the important part there. Now, they're going to still be responsible for actually honoring the commitment they made. But in terms of influencing the right stakeholders, you have to be able to measure the extent to which have we gained the commitment required of this stakeholder or that stakeholder to advance whatever project or program we are seeking to influence. And so measuring commitments in an organization like yours is absolutely essential.
I don't think that we have ever tried to specifically measure commitment. I think we have maybe tried things where we all need to communicate this message to people, and we confirm that the message has been communicated, but I don't think that we take it that next step all the time. We do that, but we never quantify that in like a reportable way. So I think that might be a really interesting suggestion for us. Thank you.
Now, securing a commitment's not easy, right? But ultimately, there is power when you get somebody to go on record saying we are committing to X, because then that becomes part of the accountability piece. You can then go back to you've established an expectation born out of having stated this commitment, and so follow-up engagement with them can always anchor back to that, which is why the commitment is so important, because it's part of the expectation setting.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
I love all of the conversation around accountability. And Bernie, I know you have a lot of thoughts around all the different aspects of achieving results as you've worked with diverse populations from business school students to military officers to other federal senior executives like April. Can you talk a little bit more about what are some of the common challenges that folks face, like what April just talked about around measurement and measuring things that you might have a little less control over, that you'd want to share?
Yeah, I'll come back to the 5 elements that I was referring to earlier. So, when thinking about accountability, these 5 things are things that I'm always trying to hammer down on. 1, clear expectations. Are you crystal clear about what you expect from yourself and others? 2, clear capability. Do you give people that which is necessary to meet your expectation? Whether it's time, money, resources, training. I always like to say you can't turn straw into gold. So you can't set an expectation for a person or a group of people without actually equipping them to be able to meet the expectation successfully. Number 3 is clear measurement. Are you measuring the right things? April talked about, hey, we could very easily get caught up in measuring widgets, but that doesn't really tell us anything about the impact we're making. So are you measuring the right things? And then, born out of that measurement, are you having the right conversations where you can provide feedback on how people and teams are doing relative to meeting the expectation? And then the last thing is clear consequence. What happens when you do meet the expectation? What happens when you don't? When you don't, you either have to change what you're doing, stop what you're doing. Like there's several things you can do: stop, start, sustain, modify, whatever it is. But many times when thinking about accountability, there's no consequence for a lack of meeting the expectation. And many times there's not a clear expectation set up front, which makes it difficult to do those other things as you go through that process of fostering accountability. And so you'll hear people say things like, oh, this is going to be a challenging conversation. I'm like, there are no challenging conversations. There are only conversations that matter. If the expectation is important, then you should be pumped about the opportunity to dialogue with someone relative to the expectation. Here's what's going well. Here's what we're going to have to modify. You're not making it personal. You're focusing on the role that they're enacting and the process that's unfolding. I always say in the best organizations, accountability is the word. And in most organizations, accountability is a dirty word. And until you culturally embrace the importance of accountability, it'll probably still have a pejorative construct. And so part of my career in the military was also spent in what we call special operations. And special operations, these are highly skilled individuals that have been specially selected, specially trained, get handed the toughest missions. And what makes special operations special is not that they have, amazing budgets or they've been given super soldiers or whatever. They strive to be the most accountable organizations there are. They do the basics better than anyone else. And because they do the basics better than anyone else and because they're the most accountable, that's what allows them to take on the most complex challenges and to fight and win. And so what I tend to find is that in most organizations, the things we say we're intent on doing, we actually aren't resolved to hold people's feet to the fire for actually doing them. And it's not to say we're not doing things that matter. It's saying that we're allowing a delta to exist between what we say we're committed to doing and what we're actually doing. And so in those instances, I always say we're underwriting mediocrity. And mediocrity, when fostered over time, leads to obsolescence and irrelevance. And so you want your organization to become more accountable? I always go back to those 5 things. You want your organization to perform more effectively? Excellence cannot be achieved through a lack of accountability. There's a statement that was once made by a gentleman, Will Durant. He was talking about the great philosophers. But for years, this quote was misattributed to Aristotle. And it said, excellence is not an act, but a habit. Therefore, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not what I do one time or, like, ooh, look at me, I was great today. Excellence is what we do all of the time. True excellence is about adherence to standards. If you set high standards and you hold people accountable for achieving those standards, great things happen. Great things happen. And so, what we look at from a research perspective as to why so many change efforts fail to achieve their stated intent, many times it's due to a lack of accountability and fatigue. Those are the two most prevalent reasons why we don't hit the mark. We weren't truly willing to hold people's feet to the fire, or along the way, people just got worn out. So I always say to do change better, it starts with and ends with accountability. What are you really willing to hold people to account for? Does that make sense?
I think Bernie, you'd probably be the first one to say easier said than done because there's a lot of those things. So, April, is there anything that sort of either stood out to you in any of the five aspects, or anything that he elaborated on there, or anything that you hear and you're like, of course, that's a great idea. We would love to do that. This is why it's hard.
Yeah, actually, it was that last bit about fatigue versus accountability that kind of piqued my interest, because especially with the transition coming up, and I think we feel a lot of pressure to kind of wrap up and create the impact on the initiatives that we have going on that are tied to specifically to an administration versus some of those evergreen things that we know we'll always work on. So you start to see and feel in your team, in your workforce, in your department, this bit of frenetic kind of activity where people are just working so hard because they want to make sure that they get to finish this thing or that thing, or have that impact, or see that product or that grant program, or whatever it might be. And it can lead to that fatigue. So even though they're holding themselves highly accountable, how do we keep our teams and our workforce and our colleagues able to produce at that level of accountability? What are some of your tips and tricks for that?
This comes back to workforce engagement. How do we foster resilience? How do we ensure well-being? I mean, there is no one right way on that. But I think one of the things that leaders can do is that leaders can take a look at things critically and say, here's what we are going to do, and here are the things that if we get to them, great, but that if it comes down to a choice between one or the other, here's what you choose. Providing people clear priorities and saying, these are the things that are must do, these are the things that are nice do, these are the things we won't do, is a leader's obligation. And many times when we get into those frenetic situations, they're just not provided that awareness. So they don't feel as if we can stop doing that so we can do this. And as you head into those things, you can't do all of them. You can't do all of them. And so as you see your people and they're trying to do all of them, but you know that it's not possible to do all of them in the time frame you have available to you, put it into those buckets. Must do, nice to do, not do. That's your obligation, so that you can help them to sustain the energy necessary to do the must do's at a minimum before time runs out.
Great tips. I like the buckets.
Speaking of buckets of rain have started here, in case you hear that. Sorry about that. And then speaking of time, we are coming, unfortunately, to the end of our conversation. And so, April, I wanted to ask you, what have been some of your main takeaways from today's conversation? Is there anything you might do differently or try out in your own leadership?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Bernie, you're like this sage of advice, and it's wonderful to be able to kind of get your perspective. Especially, I value that your experience is not just lengthy, but really very different from mine, and that you've had to make some of these leadership decisions in real life and death situations. And so I think that it distills a lot of that wisdom and kind of crystallizes it for me to be able to take advantage of. So it's really nice to be able to do that. I think specifically talking about achieving results, talking about that commitment, and really looking at how, as an organization, we can look at the commitment to something and measuring that rather than placing a focus on measuring of widgets, I think is something that I'm definitely going to take back. Many of your discussions about the different ways that we need to look at leadership, looking at leadership through transition, the idea of a balance between holding people accountable and fostering their ability to not burn out or become too fatigued to produce results, and the responsibility as a leader to create some of those off ramps and use those buckets and to help people see really for the organization, what are those buckets? What is the must do, the nice to do, and the we're not going to do? And making those decisions as a leader to help them avoid that burnout, I think is really, really important as well. So thank you so much for everything that you have shared today. It's been wonderful.
I've enjoyed the conversation.
Bernie, over to you. Any final words of wisdom for April and our audience today in terms of leading change, achieving results, or anything you'd want to share with the public service leaders here?
Yeah, the last thing I'd say is if you go back to Abraham Zalesnik's work from 1977 that distinguished leadership and management, they're not in conflict with one another. They're two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have to be very efficient. That's management. How do you optimize system and process? On the other side, you have to ensure how do we maintain relevance? How do we invest in new ways of being? And that's the leadership side. That's where we improve the organization. And if we're not careful, we tend to myopically focus on the management side of the coin. A leader's job is to foster change. A leader's job is to create discomfort. It's been said that managers seek to eliminate waste in organizations and leaders seek to inject it because they underwrite those experiments that are necessary to craft new ways of operating. And so you're going to have to go out there and continually invest in that discomfort, but you're going to have to take an appetite suppressant while you do it. And so learning how to once again invest in the smart risk over and over and over again becomes the key. And always think about what would the potential benefit be if we were to get this right? Would it be a significant improvement on our ability to accomplish the mission effectively? Not just, oh, wouldn't it be cool as if, but does this substantively improve our ability to accomplish the mission? And that mission is to always serve the collective interest of the people of the great United States of America. And so last thing I would tell April, I'm thankful for what she does on behalf of all of us. As a citizen and as a taxpayer, it is truly moving to understand the quality of leadership that we possess within our government because of people like April. And so the work that she does, the work that the partnership does, as an American citizen, I am deeply, deeply grateful for that.
Thank you so much for that.
I want to say a huge thank you to both of you today for sharing, for your candor, for your wisdom in this great conversation that we've had. We've talked about everything from leading change and prioritizing needing to balance what's going on every day with these big change things that might be coming down, whether it's AI or transitions, about accountability, setting clear expectations, going back to the basics, doing the basics better than anyone else, as Bernie says, and so many other tips, tricks, but also mindsets and philosophies that we can take away on leadership from both of you. So I want to thank you again. And I want to thank all of you for joining us in this Public Service Leadership Lab. If you haven't already, please check out our other two mentorship conversations from this week, from wherever you're watching this right now. And make sure to check out our additional resources on the public service leadership model, including case studies, reflection questions, videos, blogs, and much more on our website at ourpublicservice.org under the Public Service Leadership Institute. Thanks again, Bernie and April, for your time, your expertise, and thank you so much for your many years of service. And thanks to all of you online joining us. Bye now.